Welcome to Obsession Engineering. My 2004 ZX10 is back on the bench. I built this bike about 18 months ago, and since then it has been used, but not enough if I'm honest. And one of the reasons for that is it has the relatively common rattly clutch. And today I've actually got all the bits to fix it. For those not familiar with the project, this is a 2004 ZX10 and it is almost completely standard, except it has the slightly later calipers, which are considerably better, a Brembo master cylinder and Bitubo internals in the forks, and a rebuilt and reworked rear shock and different springs and bits like that. So it looks like a completely original 2004 ZX10, but it rides better, which is exactly what I wanted. I owned and raced one of these bikes when they were new, so it's only slightly disappointing to me that they're nearly 20 years old now. And the age does occasionally bring with it a few little issues. These bikes were common for wearing the springs in the back of the clutch and basically the clutch goes noisy, and this one has done it. But you can't buy a clutch basket because they discontinued them years ago. And to add a bit of awkwardness, there's 3 clutch basket options. So I'll finally manage to find the correct one. So the first thing I need to do is take the clutch out of there. And the reason the bike is on its side stand, not a paddock stand, is so that the oil runs away from the clutch, so I don't need to drain the oil to do the job. Because it's the clutch basket I need out the bike, I need to start by taking the clutch cover off. Now I don't need to adjust the clutch cable here because I'm going to take the bolts out that attach the clutch cable hanger to the engine. So if I take those off, I can then unhook the cable nice and easily and then buzz the other little M8 headed screws, the M6s, out of the cover and I can pull the cover off. But there is a trick to actually undoing the cover. So that is all the bolts undone, and then you could try and get a hold of the case and just pull it off, and it probably will come off. But even better than that, you can use the actuator to actually lever the case off. And there we go, we are into the clutch housing. Now because I need the basket off, I have to take the pressure plate and all the springs and bits out first, but I'm not going to be taking the plates out yet, and there is a reason for that. So to undo the clutch springs, we need a 5mm Allen key. And they're not mega tight because they're only M6, but the bolts are relatively long. So they will take a moment to undo. So we can use a cheaty method and get some electricity on the go. And as is fairly common, it's brought the spring out, but it's also brought out the post that the spring sits against, which is pretty much routine on a Kawasaki, if I'm honest. Springs are out, so now we can take the pressure plate off. So I'm going to hold the actual plate in and actually just pull the pressure plate out. So that's that removed, that can go in our cover. And the next thing to do is undo the clutch nut that sits in here. So we need to undo that big nut. And obviously you can buy nice expensive blingy clutch holding tools to hold all this while you undo the nut. But there is an easier method. So we're going to use an impact gun because it's considerably faster. And you will want a reasonable quality impact gun, and electricity makes more torque than air. So battery powered electric impact gun is great. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to hold my thumb against the clutch plates down here, and basically that's going to create enough friction in the clutch that I can undo the nut with my impact gun. And then you don't need a clutch holding tool. I have tied the brake on the bike so it won't try and move. And here we go. Clutch nut undone. So then I have my nut, a selection of spring washers because this is a slipper clutch, so these like spider springs give the clutch the slip. Basically, I shall explain it more in a minute. And then we can pull the whole hub out with the plates on, like that, one big lump. Additional washer off, and then we can get in, take the centre bearing out of the clutch basket. I've spotted a bit of a problem, and it's this little lump here, because that is part of one of the crank webs, and I won't be able to get the clutch basket to come out if that's in the way. So what I need to do is turn the crank around so that that is up here out the way and there's a gap. And to do that, I'm going to take that cover off, turn the crank around with a spanner. Because this cover comes off when you do valve clearances, it's a service cover, Kawasaki were very good and put an O-ring around the cover, so you don't have to put a new gasket on it, which is a good thing. So the next thing I need to do is give that a little bit of a turn, and that is moving that crank web just out the way. That'll do us. So now there is nothing to stop me taking the clutch out. So the bearing that sits inside the clutch has two little indents in it, so you can get screws in it, or screwdrivers in my case, and just give it a bit of a wiggle, and then the bearing will slide out, and then it gives us a load of play on the basket so that we can get the basket out of the way. It is just fighting a little bit. If you had a couple of little M4 screws it'd be easy, but there we go. So centre bearing out, and then the basket comes out just like that. So while I've got the clutch out, I can show you what's actually living behind there. So the shaft that the clutch sits on is the gearbox input shaft. So basically the crankshaft, which is here, the primary drive gear on the crank drives the big gear on the outside of the clutch. So the outside of the clutch spins all the way around with the crank. The inside of the clutch only connects to it through friction when the clutch is released and the springs are holding everything together, and then it transmits power to the input shaft of the gearbox. So it spins around like that, and then when the bike's in gear, that transmits power to the other shaft, which is here and connects to your front sprocket, and off you go driving your back wheel. Pretty simple. There is also an oil pump here which drives off the back of the clutch. This is your gear selection mechanism, so the shaft that goes in from the other end that you adjust with your foot pushes this, which is like the spring you feel against the lever. That pushes these little pins around, and that moves the selector drum around and selects different gears. So when you've got it all stuck there, I would say it looks lovely and simple. It doesn't, it looks really complicated. And to be honest, it reasonably is. The other item with these Kawasaki's is, up here is the generator. Now most of the time the generator hangs on the end of the crankshaft, but for these bikes Kawasaki decided to try and make the engine slimmer, so they put the generator up at the top. But that means it's got this gear drive from the clutch up to the generator. And that is one of the issues with the clutch on Kawasaki's, on these ZX10s in particular. So this is the clutch basket I've just taken out of the bike, and if I give it a shake, you can hear that's rattling, and the reason it rattles is the springs in the back wear. Now if I put it down there, you can actually see in the corners here the springs have been wearing against the actual the back of the basket, and then the springs go loose and everything rattles. Now it doesn't actually affect how the bike rides, but it is quite annoying, especially when you're sat at traffic lights and stuff and everything's warm, and that rattles quite a lot. And that's actually one of the reasons I've stopped riding the bike very much, is because I just find it annoying. Even though I know it's fine, it's annoying. So that clutch basket with its rattly clutches, rattly springs, is done. This one that I found on the internet doesn't rattle, and that's a good thing. But this wasn't particularly easy to find, and there is a reason for that. Basically they have these code numbers on them, and this is a C2. Even though it's upside down, it is a C2. Conveniently, the one that I've taken out is also a C2, and there is a reason why I need these to match. The C codes the primary drive gear to the gear that drives the generator. So if you have an A or a B, there'd be too much play and it'd rattle, and we don't want that. If, for example, you had an A generator and tried to fit a C, it wouldn't fit, it'd be too tight and it'd wear everything out. So we needed a C. The 2 actually relates to this bearing that sits inside it, because they came in slightly different sizes. So there was 3 sizes of bearing and 3 sizes of gear mesh. So you had to get the correct primary drive gear on your clutch, and being as you can't change them, you had to buy the correct clutch basket, and that's why it's taken me over a year and a couple of £100 to find a good clutch basket to use. But now I've got the correct clutch basket, I can go and fit it. I've given this one a bit of a clean, and I've just given it a bit of a check over. There's like a little bit of wear in here where the clutch plates run against it, but I run my finger against it, they're not too bad. If that gets really worn and really ridged, it means the clutch doesn't operate as easily because the clutch plates stick in here, so that'll be not a lot of use. This is the hub that sits inside, and this is the one that came with this clutch, and this is actually no good, because if I give this a wiggle, you can just see there's a tiny little bit of movement, and it means these rivets that hold the two halves together are worn and they've gone a bit loose. So we're going to be using the hub that came originally with the bike. This is the backing plate that came with my new basket, but it's in no better condition than the one I've got, so I'm going to reuse my one. And this is how the slipper clutch works. Basically, you see these little ramps here, there's 3 of them, and they correlate to these 3 posts that are angled on the back of the clutch. So if I put the 2 bits together, like that, if the engine is trying to go faster than the back wheel and you need some slip in your slipper clutch, what happens is the hub slides against that backing plate on those ramps, and because it lifts this up, it pushes the pressure plate away at the front of the clutch, takes the load off the clutch plates, and basically reduces the friction and allows the clutch to slip. And then when the wheel speed versus the engine speed are the same again, that will come back into contact and you don't get any slip anymore. And the little spider springs we saw earlier sit in here and they tension this up. So if I want this to slip easier, I can take one of the spring plates out, one of the spider plates out, spider springs out even, and then this will slide easier and you'd get more slip from your slipper clutch. Or if your stack height of plates was smaller, you'd also get more slip. So if you want to, you can adjust these slipper clutches, although it is a little rudimentary. Enough chat, time to put that back in my bike. Always worth checking that the washer that goes against the gearbox bearing is the right way around, because there's a very, very slight taper on one side so that it doesn't hit the outside of the bearing. So making sure that's the right way around, that can go in there. And then when I put the basket in, I have to line it up with the gear in here, because the gear for the generator drive has a silencing gear in it, so the teeth sit, in effect you've got like teeth like that, and then the silencing gear teeth sit slightly offset from them and spring load against them, so the 2 gears don't rattle against each other like that. So when you put this in, you have to sort of slide it in and then push it upwards to engage into the gear as you put the bearings in. You can actually see that's the spring loading for the silencing gear. So I have to make sure I've got that loaded up as I slide the centre spacer in, like the sleeve bearing in. So the actual centre sleeve isn't too bad, but now I want to put this bit in. I've got to make sure that I'm pushing this up at the same time. There we go, so that is the clutch refitted, the basket refitted. So with the basket in, I want my sort of backing spacer, backing washer fitting into there, and then I'm going to fit my plates and my hub. To get the backing plate on, it's just a case of sliding that in there and lining it up with the splines. So it will slide on in a minute, just like that. Then I can slide the hub in, making sure that the slipper clutch sort of ramps line up with the indents in here. Right, that's in. You can see that that can slide up its ramps like that. And what I'm actually going to do next is put my spring washers, my like spider washers that sit in the middle of the clutch in. So these, you can see, are angled. So if I want to alter how much slip my slipper clutch has, if I take one of these out, or ideally just bend the tabs up on 1 or 2 of them, then these will have less spring and it will mean the slipper clutch can slip more easily, but I like it as it is. So we're going to slide those in, slot them in the back here, and then we're going to buzz the clutch nut back up just loose to begin with the impact gun. So nice and slowly. There we go, that's just tucked in there for a minute. So the other trick, if you want to alter the slip in your slipper clutch, is you can alter the height of the stack. If the stack height, like the height of the whole clutch pack, is smaller, the clutch will slip easier. So on corner entry you can get more slip in your slipper clutch. And you can do that by changing the steel plates, because you can actually get these in 3 different thicknesses. Standard is 2.6mm thick, there is some 2.9s and 2.3s. But again, we're staying standard. The clutch plate that sits on both ends is actually different. You see this has got more blocks on it, more sort of friction material than the inner plates, because these ones are obviously running on the aluminium that's on the backing plate and the pressure plate, and the rest are running against steel. So they are different plates. So what I'm going to do is I've got the whole pack, and I've actually got it upside down, so that we're putting it back together the order it came out. At the back of the clutch, there is this special anti-judder plate with springs in it. So basically that means the clutch doesn't judder when you're setting off. So the later bikes, the 06 onwards bikes, didn't get this because it costs more money to make. But it is better. In fact, the 06 onwards bikes, the 06 and 08, the kit clutch, if you wanted a better clutch, was in fact the standard clutch from an 04 bike. So bit by bit, we'll get this built up. Another slight difference on the 04-05 bike is the steel plates had little dimples all over them, and the idea of that was it held a tiny bit of oil against the clutch plates and stopped them overheating as easily when you were doing race starts. The later bikes were completely plain, so another mod was to fit these so that your clutch actually lasted longer. The last plate on these bikes, Kawasaki actually tell you to put it offset from all the other plates. I don't actually know why. Some bikes tell you to do it, some bikes tell you not to do it. Never actually found out what the difference is. Next stage, of course, is to tighten the clutch nut up. Officially 130 Newton meters, but to do that I would need a torque wrench and a clutch holding tool, and if I'm honest, I've never used a good clutch holding tool that is actually easy to use and easy to grip. So what I tend to do is the same as I did to undo it. Thumb against the pack and then buzz it up with the impact gun. And what will happen is when it gets to basically the right torque, the inner here will actually slide round slightly and basically limit so you can't over torque it. So that's that tight. While I put the camera on charge for a minute, I've just buzzed that cover back on, and the only thing I've done with that is just put a smear of grease on the O-ring, because a greased ring is always a good thing. And I've put the 2 posts that I pulled out of here back in, and I've put plenty of Loctite on them, and you'll need an 11mm spanner to tighten them up. And then you of course have the problem of when you try and pull them tight, the centre of the clutch slides, so you end up with one hand pulling on the spanner and one hand tensioning up the pack, so like with the clutch nut, it loads everything up and then nothing moves. So the next thing to do is put my pressure plate on. Kawasaki's pressure plates are pretty simple. It's a plate with a pin for the actuator and a bearing in the middle. Some manufacturers put little springs and bits on them to stop stuff rattling around, and Yamaha have a tendency to put little washers in here underneath the springs, but Kawasaki make it pretty simple for you. The only thing is there's 2 indents here that you have to line up with 2 indents on here to make sure we get it lined up right. So we will drop that into there, make sure the indents are lined up, and obviously then everything drops together and you can see it touching the pressure, touching the clutch plates, so you know it's in correctly. And then we just need to put the bolts and the springs back in. So with all my springs tightened up, the next thing to do is to put the cover back on. Now normally I'd give this a thorough clean off with some Scotch-Brite and maybe a penknife and then put a new gasket on. But the gasket on this one is in such good condition that I'm actually just going to put it back on. Part of the reason it's in good condition is when I had the clutch part last time, I greased the gasket up before I fitted it, and that's just given it a bit more chance to pull off the casing without splitting. So we're just going to slide this back onto here. I've got the actuator sort of out at the moment, wiggling out the way, so that when I get it somewhere pretty close, and it is a little bit of a game because you've got to get the centre pin located, and there we go, that is in. So the next thing to do, put all the bolts back in. Putting bolts back in the cover is pretty straightforward, but you just have to be careful of one thing: there are 3 different lengths. So most of the bolts are short, 2 up here are quite long, and then just to be fun, This one is 5mm longer than all the little ones, so you've just got to make sure you get them all in the right place. But basically, if you pop them all in the holes before you tighten any of them up, you will see that all the bolts stick out the same amount. I have left these two out because they're holding the clutch actuator arm on, so we'll get to those in a moment. But these all want doing up, and generally with Kawasaki it will be 12 Newton meters. We are nearing completion. I just need to hook my clutch cable back into its holder, like, it's a little bit fiddly, I'll be honest, like that. Hook that in there, and then I can put my last two bolts in, which hold the clutch cable actuator holder thingy in place. That's the clutch actuator perch thing refitted, all that bolted back together, side panel refitted, and I have to admit the bodywork panels on the bottom half of this bike are incredibly easy to do, so we will lower the bench down and see what it sounds like when we start it. Well, there's no horrible jangly noise, so that is a good thing. I'm a happy boy because that no longer has a rattly clutch, and it is a relatively easy job to do once you've found the clutch. So that's one less excuse for not riding my ZX10, so it's time for me to take it off the bench and get it on the road. Thank you for watching, and join me again next time for some more motorbike fun.